The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for holding on for a few minutes. We're experiencing some slight technical difficulties. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Emerging Best Practices in Strategic Sourcing. My name is Brian Munson. I'm the Director of Membership Development for NCBA CLUSA, and I will be your moderator today. Our panelist is from Crowe Horwath, LLP, Will Niblo. He's a senior manager there. Before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping for you. Participant phone lines will be muted during this presentation to reduce background noise. That said, we encourage you to ask our panelists questions in the question box that is provided on your control panel. NCBA CLUSA will also be recording this program, and it will be archived on our website. You will receive an email containing a link to the posted recording early next week. This webinar is the 7th in a series of educational demos presented by NCBA CLUSA and our associate members. Associate members of NCBA CLUSA are service providers with a defined expertise, and the aim of this series is to help co-ops navigate certain business challenges that are common to all the sectors. That being said, Crowe Horwath is one of the largest public accounting and consulting firms in the U.S. with a total of more than 3,000 personnel. Crowe and its subsidiaries have offices coast to coast. The firm is recognized by organizations as one of the country's best places to work, which is, I'm sure, why you'll find Will there. Under the services offered, they have a core purpose, building value with values. And so it's obvious that Crowe Horwath is committed to using its deep industry expertise to provide audit services to public and private entities while also helping clients reach their goals with tax, advisory, risk, and performance services. Just a quick bit of background on Will before we get started. As I said, he's a senior manager with Crowe Horwath, and he leads the strategic sourcing practice. He has a BS in supply chain management from Michigan State University. And prior to Crowe, Will has 15 years of operations and supply chain management experience, including 8 years in procurement and supply chain management with the Ford Motor Company and DESTA Company. So, Will, I think that we're at a point where we can get started, so I'm going to turn the webinar over to you. And if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the box as Will's going along, and we'll be sure to circle back and get those answered for you. Will?
Great. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Make sure I got control of this thing. So thanks for the kind introduction. You know, as Brian said, he introduced me as the practice leader for Crowe's strategic sourcing practice. So that's fairly interesting in terms of title, right? But what matters is why we would have perspective on the market. And so the reason that we have good perspective on what good looks like in sourcing and supply chain is because a typical day in the life for myself or a member of our team is we spend time working with supply chain and procurement organizations within manufacturing to solve tough procurement and supply chain related problems. So in the last 2 weeks, as an example, I've been to 5 different cities and worked with 8 different companies and their procurement and supply chain teams on various challenges. So we have good perspective on what good looks like and the types of issues that people face within the market. So a lot of what we're going to share with you today has to do with our learnings over the years in terms of what good looks like and best practices identified. And it's all the more important that we highlight how it relates to a co-op business, because it's our take on this that the challenges that most sourcing organizations deal with in a manufactured environment, quite frankly, are even worse when you're dealing with a co-opted environment because you have even less control over the outside of your organization. You know, simple examples of that everyone has to deal with is we all select suppliers and work with various suppliers, but our success is largely contingent on those suppliers and their performance, right? In a co-opted environment, how you maintain relationships with your suppliers and how they view you as an overall customer has a lot to do with how your clients behave. Are they spending money on those agreements? Treating those suppliers well? Do they use them strategically? Those types of things. And then outside of everyone's control are, of course, events in the marketplace. So one recent example of that is the recent merger of Office Max and Office Depot, and the impact that that had on many co-op buying organizations and supply programs, because it created an event in the marketplace that directly what many viewed as being the cost leader staples. So in the last year, we've spent a good bit of time working with many different organizations, manufacturing and co-ops and the like, working through the challenges of that market event. So, you know, we find that as good as manufacturing companies can be at the actual tactical exercises around procurement, supplier management, and the like, we often find that there's some lacking ability in their ability to influence others outside of their organization, and that being the case, limits their ability to be successful in their role. So what we're going to follow with here is we're going to share 7 best practices that we've identified and we associate with what good looks like. And we find that they are differentiators in the marketplace for sourcing organizations that truly are adding more value in the organization and behaving strategically versus those that are filling a more tactical role. So first and foremost, a sourcing organization, and this is not always the case, needs to have appropriate and adequate authority and proper responsibilities assigned to them. It may seem obvious that that might be the case and that that would be a best practice, but what you find is that's not actually always the case, and especially in a co-op environment where you are not directly part of the client corporate structure that you're supporting, you know, a lot of those relationships can be at an arm's length. So one recent example of this is a client we worked with. It was a food co-op business that was supporting a franchised fast food restaurant. And in this particular case, the co-op organization served in the middle of the corporate offices of the restaurant and the franchise owners themselves, and both were accountable to a board. What we found is that the co-op organization really didn't have a lot of influence or involvement in the supplier selection and decision-making process. However, they were absolutely accountable and responsible for managing those relationships after they were put in place. So an example that we're going to give later in the presentation helps to round this story out with what that organization has done to secure their seat at the table and to improve the voice that they have in the discussion when they're selecting suppliers or making decisions related to the supply chain. You know, so by extension, it's one thing to be able to influence internally within your organization, decision-making as it relates to the selection of suppliers and management of them, but it's also equally important that your suppliers themselves, once selected, are aware that you have the power of decision-making and the power to influence how your clients are spending money. So all too often, we encounter situations where in a co-opted environment, the co-op is so entrenched with one particular supplier and their clients are reliant on that particular supplier, it's nearly an impossible task or an incredibly politically sensitive topic to entertain the idea of moving away to other suppliers. And so when that happens, of course, in a lot of cases, we find that co-ops tend to lose their edge on the on the better pricing that they're able to provide to their clients and the better pricing that their clients would expect. So leadership, it's really tough to have a discussion about best practices without involving leadership as a best practice. And when it comes to procurement, it's not any different. What we find is most distinct here is that in a procurement organization, similar to other departments, there's a lot of internal selling of ideas that has to happen. And we find that if the persons in charge of the procurement role don't have the ability to communicate and sell ideas on all levels within the business, we find that the procurement organization doesn't move forward. We're working with a client right now, actually. I spent a good part of my morning on the phone with this client. We're working to help them source a freight category. And the challenge that we're having isn't that we've identified good suppliers or that we've identified savings or that the procurement organization can provide good value to the overall business. The issue that we're having is that the procurement organization and their leaders themselves have no credibility within the business. And we find that in the past, this particular client, the leaders in that procurement group have burned a lot of bridges along the way. And so we're having a lot of challenges in selling the idea within the organization without directly confronting the issue of how these leaders interact with the business. And our plan there, of course, is going to be to address that, and that's to help move this forward. But that issue alone and the lack of leadership within that business is inhibiting that client's ability to move their agenda forward. And we find that that's pretty common. So this is similar to themes 1 and 2, but it's different because what we're talking about here is really more operational in the form of getting your procurement and supply chain folks involved at the front end of a new product development cycle and absolutely involved in an integrated way to schedule and planning exercises. So, one example of this, a client that we recently worked with that I referenced early on in the presentation, they were challenged with how they were engaged. This is the food co-op, by the corporate offices and then also, of course, by the franchisees. One of the things that they worked really hard on was how they got involved with the corporate offices and the marketing department when they were going to release new products in the marketplace. And so they did a couple things that were pretty pragmatic, right? So one was they set up a regularly scheduled weekly meeting wherein they would interact with the marketing group on the other side of it, so they understood what was in the pipe, what was coming their way, what types of decisions were being made, so they could in kind communicate that to the supply base and begin to help provide guidance on supplier selection, and then also give visibility, downstream so that people weren't caught off guard once they made a decision on doing a promotion. The other thing they did was they actually physically moved their offices to be closer to the client and corporate office that they served. And in doing so, a lot of interactions that would happen through a phone call became 1-hour meetings or 15-minute meetings that were face-to-face. And that was a real game changer for them. So through those two exercises, they were able to take their new product development cycle from a 8 to 12-month cycle and cut that in half. And this company has actually emerged as a market leader in the fast food industry for their ability to identify, promote, and release new products in that space. And it's contributed in large part to their success in the last couple of years. Another place that we see this in the planning side with manufacturers has to do with a sales inventory and operations planning cycle. And it just has to do with having an integrated plan wherein your procurement and supply chain folks are involved in the forecasting, scheduling, inventory management discussions, and that they're not only in the room but have an opinion and then are communicating those things to the supply base along the way. So similar to the sales, inventory, and operations planning theme, we find that buyers themselves tend to be very technically good at the fundamentals of actually buying, right? So they understand how to manage supplier relationships. They understand how to do the tactical negotiations of agreements and the like. What we have also found is that most buyers, at least not all, have the capabilities and a real mature understanding of materials management and supply chain itself and how that relates to the overall organization. We find that they're just pretty good at what they do, however, don't have perspective on an integrated view of how they fit. And when procurement folks develop and have a mature understanding of materials management, inventory management, and operations, that it can be a game changer for how people work with suppliers. Because it gives those buyers the ability to make better selections on the types of vendors you use, and then in what way you work with those vendors. So one recent example of this was a client we were working with. It was a vitamin company, and they buy a lot of bottles, as an example. So this particular company had a very large portion of their facility dedicated to bottles and bottle storage, which take up a lot of space because there's a lot of air. And they were buying from a large amount of distributors. We worked with them over the course of a couple of months, identified the capabilities of the current distributors, identified the manufacturers they were working with, and then submitted a proposal out to the market on how they could improve their management of how they work with these suppliers. And what we came up with was we reduced the supply base from 8 different companies down to 2. And they had a relationship with a manufacturer, and they had a relationship with a distributor. And what we worked out was an agreement that allowed our client to order directly from the manufacturer for high-velocity materials, high-volume materials, but also to have a relationship with a local distributor that would keep backup inventories and would provide other services in kind. The net result of understanding the materials management component and supply chain component of the supply base and how it related to the operations translated in freeing up about 50,000 square foot of warehouse space that was previously dedicated to storage of bottles. Brought that down to a much more smaller amount of space. And now this client receives daily deliveries of bottles from their manufacturer and distributor to support their scheduling needs for a 2-day work cycle. So by understanding those things, it was a real game changer for that particular client. So this is a tough one that we find for a lot of clients. Most people are really good at, or at least believe themselves to be very good at, their top spend categories. So if we're going in to talk to a metal fabrication company, it's obvious that that company thinks that they're pretty darn good at buying metals, right? Not always the case, but they certainly think they are. This morning I had a call with a meat processing company. This company spends about $250 million a year on red meat products. They think they're pretty good at buying red meat, which is true, right? They do have some real competency there. However, what is lost with clients a lot of times in these top strategic spend categories is over time, for political reasons and other strategic reasons, the organization itself loses the ability to take a critical, self-reflective look at how they manage those categories. And so we find that one of the best ways to make sure that you stay best in class relative to market for your top categories is you really have to schedule it. You really have to have an internal, non-biased, scheduled process that in a lot of cases brings in an outside perspective to look at how you're managing those key categories. And as an organization, you need to be willing to challenge yourself and the business on how you're managing some of those more critical categories. And when you don't, we find that oftentimes you lose ground in the market relative to others, or you fall out of sync with what best in class looks like in those markets. So that discussion that I had this morning with the meat buying group, what they found is that red meat prices are going a little crazy this year, and that their old bag of tricks for how they would buy and take positions relative to market are no longer effective. And so, we're working with them to discuss how they're approaching market now and to get them back in line with a set of tools, capabilities, and processes that are more in line with what other people are doing, that buy similar amounts in similar ways. So supplier management and how suppliers are managed is also a differentiator. And I don't mean to get down on supplier scorecards. I think they have their place. But I really feel that, and we see that, organizations that perform better than others in terms of procurement have a very methodical, clearly communicated, and well-managed process for how they're managing their supplier relationships. Specifically, the more strategic supplier relationships. Some of the best behaviors that we see out there is that folks are meeting with their top key suppliers on a quarterly basis to have business review discussions. So no scorecard needs to be involved that includes on-time delivery or quality metrics or other types of graphs and charts. It's simply the exercise of sitting down with your strategic partners and having discussions about your business and how those businesses work together. And then in those meetings, setting goals, setting actions that the group is then held accountable for and discussed and reviewed in the next meeting. And by running that playbook, we find that people get more benefit out of that management approach than they do out of, for example, sending out a scorecard in a more anonymous fashion, which we see is more common. In the last observation, and this one's also seems relatively obvious, but we find that it's probably the most lacking in the market. We find that few people do this well, is what I'm trying to say. So best-in-class companies have a good understanding and segmentation around the suppliers they use, and they also, in kind, have really put some thought into what they would do if that supplier was to go away. And they have good documented contingency plans in place for those events if and when. Probably my most recent example of this is a couple weeks ago I spent an afternoon with a purchasing group at a company based in Wisconsin. They have a very large spend in the stainless steel area. And on that particular day when I was meeting with my client to discuss how they were going to go to market for the next year, the guy had to leave in the middle of our meeting because one of his top suppliers for electrical components had just announced bankruptcy. And there was no plan in place, there was no protocol in place other than just a reaction to, oh man, what are we going to do now? And that's not an uncommon event. So whether it's bankruptcy or whether it's whatever set of reasons, we find that most people, when there's an event in the market that's affecting their supplier, are caught off guard by those events and very rarely have plans in place for addressing that. And so then the net result of that is reacting and then typically aligning yourself with somebody else in a very non-strategic way, right? So you just kind of end up with whoever can take on your business because there wasn't a plan in place. So the point here is that our group largely advises manufacturing and distribution companies on supply chain strategies and procurement strategies. But there's a lot of things happening in those groups and lessons to be learned from their best practices in what good looks like in the co-op environment. And in the end, by taking some of these learnings and applying them to your own business and how you run your own business, that there's something to be gained in how you're sourcing and how you're managing your clients from a sourcing perspective going forward. So with that said, I appreciate you listening patiently. I wanted to make sure that I left some time here on the back end to answer any questions that the participants might have.
We're going to wait for those to come in. Thanks, Will, for the information there. We've got one. Will, what prevents companies from getting started with strategic sourcing initiatives?
Yeah, okay. So we find there's a couple different things. Kind of first and foremost, when it comes to strategic sourcing related initiatives, it's really first and foremost that most companies don't view it as being a strategically important department, right? So a lot of times when I'm working with clients, we're invited to come spend time with them because there's been an event, right? So there's some type of a financial failure that they're facing, or they just lost a critical bid, or they ran an RFP and they got a much higher result than what they were expected, or they got a benchmark that tells them that they're not as competitive as they thought. But it's usually event-driven. Most of the time, people just are not making investments in strategic sourcing initiatives because they really are missing the point on how important and critical in the benefits of a strategic sourcing program. So for example, for the folks that we work with in manufacturing, the difference between folks that buy well and folks that don't can be as much as 2 to 5% in boost to EBITDA for folks that are buying well.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. See if we have any others that come in. Okay, Will, what types of savings results can be achieved through strategic sourcing work, or that are achieved?
Sure, good question. Yep. I about never have a conversation with folks without being asked in the first 2 or 3 questions, how much savings can we achieve? So I can appreciate that you're asking it. So just kind of some general rules of thumb. First and foremost, you got to first look at what is addressable and what is not. So if you identify a category where you want to actually do a strategic sourcing exercise, let's just say that it's packaging, I'll make it up, and it's $1 million in spend, you can't quantify your savings until you really understand what is addressable spend and what is not addressable. So let's just say, for example, in that $1 million of packaging spend, there's $200,000 of it that is proprietary in nature, or it's just very difficult to influence, or it's customer specified, or et cetera, right? So calculating the savings that can be achieved really begins with first figuring out how much of your spend you can really influence first. And then once you figure that out, a couple general rules can be applied. So if you're dealing with a raw material, for example, something you grow or would mine out of the ground, markets are pretty transparent. There's not a lot of value added. People really understand those things pretty well. So you're talking about single-digit percentage savings, call it 1 to 5%, is typically what people can drive. And then when you're dealing with other more commoditized items, right, that are more readily available, where, for example, items bought through distribution, nothing's particularly unique about them. It's very reasonable to expect 15, 20% plus in savings, assuming that you can get your organization on board with really running a strategic event.
Gotcha. Thank you, Will. See if we have any others that will come in here. Will, what's the just for the folks online? What's the best way to get in touch with you? How can they reach out to you if they have more questions about this?
Sure, good question. So pretty simple. I, like everybody else, have a cell phone tied to me at all times. So I'm happy to share my phone number with the participants after this call. We could just send out a quick note. And anybody's welcome to call me anytime to talk through some of these things.
Great. We'll make sure that we do that for you. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so it looks like that's going to be all for today. We certainly thank everybody for being online. Thank you to Will for your time today and for your insight on sourcing. And as I said, this webinar will be available. If anybody wants the recorded version of it, we're happy to provide that. We'll be sending out a quick follow-up survey. And please check back in throughout the month on our Facebook page, the NCBA CLUSA Facebook page, as we continue to highlight our associate members and some of the services that they provide as co-ops and other businesses, of course, are getting into their own strategic planning. So, Will, I think this was a very timely webinar. Again, we thank you for your time. Thank you for the support of Crowe Horwath to NCBA CLUSA. And we look forward to more from you guys in the future.
Great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.